Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge.
Hi, this episode is about effective distributed work, self-managed and digital first. Work that is deliberately designed and documented. Work that is transparently shared. And collaboration is systematized through strategic corporate decisions. To discuss the contours, characteristics, and culture of distributed work, I'm delighted to be speaking with JJ Reeder, a workplace innovator and culture transformation leader. JJ future-proofs great workplaces with digital-first, scalable AI operations, enhanced by her deep experience designing communication systems and aligning culture with strategy. Hi, JJ. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am well. And I always start at the beginning, which starts with you studying linguistics at university, correct?
That's correct.
Linguistics is very specific. I know several people who actually studied linguistics.
I did not know what linguistics was before I enrolled in that major. I was very interested in languages growing up. And so I thought that if I would go into a linguistics program, it would be the study of various languages, which it is, but not, because linguistics is really the theory of language and the philosophy of language, sociology of language. It's the mechanics behind language, right? So I got into my first course on the first day of the first semester, and I was sitting in the lecture. I immediately fell in love with linguistics.
You did?
I had no idea what I was in for. I didn't even know there was a theory behind language. There's a science behind this. I just lit up. And so I inhaled everything to do with linguistics. I did a year abroad in France in the end and studied linguistics there at University of Toulouse, and just found that opened my mind so much further. And I started to really understand sort of language as code as well, which I think prepared me well to work in the future with engineers and to be sort of ready for the tech world.
What were some of the things that linguistics brought to the fore for you in terms of understanding whether it be the French culture or the American culture or other aspects of life that were manifested in language?
What I took away from linguistics study were a couple of things. So first, linguistics gave me a framework to understand the history of humanity. I really got into historical and comparative linguistics. So I was looking at things like migration of languages over time and how that reflected the migration of people over time, cultural exchanges that happen over time. The other thing that really affected me is being able to actually go and live in another culture and to communicate in that culture and to exist in that culture and to try to throw away some of the things that I was holding on to about being American. And actually, in one of your recent episodes, Raj Chowdhury touched on this, the immense opportunity that it opens up for people to be able to travel and live in different countries at a young age. Yeah. For me, that's very, very true. It opened up the world for me. It helped me to understand where I was limited and where I needed to be more open. And it also just gave me a different lens on the world. And so now I'm always trying to travel and meet people from other cultures and understand as much as I can, just because I know that I know so little. And the more that I can see things through others' eyes, the more I can learn.
You also took it to programmers and developers. How did you change how you use language? Because obviously, in all the things that we're doing right now, there's such a strong thread and integration of technology that kind of understanding is very useful.
I love working with engineers. I think engineers are, in some ways, very effective communicators, but you have to speak their language. And so, because they get to the point, they're very direct, they're literal. And sometimes that's very helpful in communication, is when people just say what they're thinking and what it really means. And so I love working with developers. And I do think some of that comes from being able to deconstruct language and really understand that there's meaning and there's implication, and there's symbology, and there are, different layers to how we understand communication. But at the base of it, it's really just information transfer. And so if you have to put aside all the rest of it, you need the information transfer. That part is you can't go without it. And that's what I love about engineers. They just go straight to the information.
You've had a lot of work which is related to content creation in different forms, communication, of sort of leaning into that use of language and clarity. How did you make that transition from sort of saying that, I want to get more engaged and actually use that communication to stimulate more community and connection across people who are working in a distributed way, right?
That's another one that I sort of fell into sideways, really. When I first started working, it was in an office, and I didn't last very long. I'll tell you, I just wasn't for me. I may be like a little bit of what the kids are calling neurospicy these days. I'm not sure. I didn't function well in an office environment, and so I knew that I needed to opt out and to figure out how to work in a home office in just a slightly more controlled environment. That I would be able to focus better, be able to be more productive, and be happier. So for years, I built my own career. I just sort of hacked it together. And I ended up doing great, cool projects, like very exciting things. Right. A lot of that was around communication and content because that was something that I was good at and that people would hire me for. And over time, I started to see that it was becoming more organized on the corporate side. There was a little bit of remote work was starting to happen. And I was interested. I wanted to actually get into tech and get into the tech world. I've always had an affinity for this industry. But I had never been able to get into the industry because I didn't work in an office. And Toptal was one of the first all remote companies.
Which was connecting developers, right? It was a huge developer community, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so I was hired on to the community marketing team there. And so then we were working with this community of thousands of developers located all around the world. And I, once again, just sort of realized what an opportunity there was to do something really interesting here. No one had really nailed yet how to build community across cultures and to do it in a distributed way and to do it asynchronously. But the community team at Toptal was doing an excellent job. They were doing some really cool stuff. We did, hundreds of events every year, probably 600 or more events every year, all around the world.
These developers are all individual contributors. They're not working for Toptal. They are remote talent. Toptal needed to keep people connected so that they would be available for Toptal projects or people signing up or looking for talent through Toptal, correct?
That's right. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. The relationship was that these were very highly skilled developers and also, some product people, and they were able to be farmed out to very successful companies doing high-end work. And so when you are working with very talented people, they have a lot of opportunities. Sure. And so our role was to make sure that they felt appreciated and that they felt engaged and they had some sense of connection to the community of developers that we felt would help make them more engaged with Toptal and more willing to sign up for Toptal engagements because they also had access to this community benefit. Sure. And so we were trying to provide opportunities for people to get to know someone in their region who also worked for Toptal, even if they were on separate projects and might not have interacted in other ways. So we did a lot of meetups, a lot of, information exchanges, also conferences. We would train people. I trained people to be public speakers, which was a blast. So all of that was in service of how do we connect people who may not otherwise be connected in this fully remote environment.
And then March 2020, you moved to GitLab. Had you planned to move in March, or was it a function of the pandemic? How did that happen? And then what?
I had planned to move in March.
Okay.
Wow. I had,
Well, I guess it doesn't matter because GitLab is a completely, is a fully remote company, but still is an extraordinary time.
Yeah, it mattered, not in the way that I intended. I'm always looking at the systems behind things, right? And so I had gotten into this idea of, okay, if we can systematize connection for these people who are located all around the world,
Right.
and there's something there. This is an organization. This is this is some kind of a framework. This is a model. And I found out about GitLab, which was all remote and was really leaning into this organizational model, supporting remote work and being completely remote and doing it in this very, going back to the communication thing, this very literal, direct sort of way. Just understanding the value of information transfer and having that flat organizational structure that you mentioned. Darren Murph was there as head of remote, and he was looking for his first person to join his team. And he hired me on as that person. And so it was like we immediately knew we were speaking one another's language from early on in the interview process. It was a great fit. We've been great partners. And I joined on March 2nd, 2020, thinking that I would have a slow ramp, that we would take time to figure out what this new role would be, that we would set our strategy. And 2 weeks later, the pandemic shut down workplaces around the world, and suddenly we were being called on to very quickly teach the world how to do remote work. So that was a rocket ship. It was a difficult situation. I'm not going to lie. That was a stressful time. I mean, I was sanitizing my groceries and scared to leave my house and wondering how my parents are going to survive. And then at the same time, I'm working these super long days trying to solve difficult problems for organizations I've never had contact with as a brand new person in my role. It was not easy.
Yes, I'm sure. And at the same time, you already knew a lot of the issues and challenges and important touch points and ways of connecting with people that you had already been helping all the top talent developers with. What were some of the things that GitLab was doing differently, both for all the people who work for GitLab all over the world, and then also how they were trying to communicate that to the different companies who were suddenly working remotely in a forced way? And I say that very specifically because I know how different it is for an organization that has started off fully remote than a company that has started off fully in office, and then goes to hybrid or fully remote or some combination. It's a very different mentality and often very different types of people who have very purposefully chosen a different type of working arrangement and working locations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So GitLab was very much almost as if it was created in a lab for the perfect conditions for remote work.
Right.
It had always been remote. The CEO, Sid Sijbrandij, is a wonderful leader who was very bought in on remote work. He understood not just the value of working remotely, but a lot of the principles behind it. And he was interested in the cultural transformation that could happen in the world if he helped build a remote work model. Darren was a fabulous communicator who had done a ton of work before the pandemic to document so many elements of the organization, how it worked, what sort of tools and systems were in place. And so we entered the pandemic with not only a highly functioning organization that continued to thrive even during the lockdowns, but full documentation on how it worked. And a team that was dedicated to teaching the world. I mean, it couldn't have been better conditions.
But
those conditions don't transfer to every organization.
Not at all.
And that was something more and more as I did this work, I started to realize. We were very dogmatic. We believed that this was the way to do it because we had direct observational proof that it worked. But over time, I started to gain more and more insight into, once again, we're looking at it through a very specific lens and we need to broaden the lens. We need to take a different lens. And yes, one of those very important lenses is what about the companies that are transitioning? A lot of companies, Upwork among them, started the pandemic in office, went through the lockdown, and decided to stay remote as much as possible. Some companies weren't able to stick that landing. They weren't able to see it through.
Right.
Upwork and a few others really decided to stick it out. But what were they dealing with? How could we advise them? We, from the GitLab perspective, didn't really understand what they were up against.
In the revelations that you had from a lot of interactions with people who were struggling during the pandemic to try and understand. I mean, it was forced, and there were a lot of realizations that I saw as people understood, well, oh my goodness, I can be productive in this way, and I can focus much more in this particular environment, and these are the things I need, and these are the things I don't need, and this is what suits me and this is what doesn't suit me. So I think there were some certain epiphanies that people had, and much more self-awareness about themselves as workers, which nobody had ever really had to have. What were some of the key things that you picked up on in terms of people trying a functioning hybrid modality? It is strange to me that when so many elements of what we're doing and how we're working are changing, that managers and leaders haven't focused more on, let's look at all of these different elements. And I'd like to talk a bit about, GitLab and being that flat organization, which I had mentioned before we started recording, in terms of management is different. We're thinking about work differently. We're breaking jobs down into skills and projects. There were so many different elements of work are changing. How did you see people going through some of that evolution where you were in both more advanced as well as on a slightly different track?
That's a great question. There are many questions sort of couched in that, and there are many answers couched in that as well. That's the big sort of nut that we're all trying to crack is, what is it that we need to do to make this work? Those of us who have been in the remote work and future of work world for a while, we believe that it will absolutely work. We believe the future of work looks like this. It's distributed. Mm-hmm. So why do leaders feel that it's not working? And I think that's really the crux of the issue that we're at right now, because we've got the bottom-up buy-in, but we don't have the top-down buy-in. Remote work made things easier for workers, but more difficult for managers and leaders.
Managers who aren't that great, and most managers are not. Supposedly Gartner says, 10% of people are good managers. Yes. So for the 90% who are managers, it is definitely needs more attention.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of it, is really understanding how to lead people when you can't see them. And not enough of the problem has been solved in how it blocks managers and leaders from being able to lead. We haven't understood that yet. An organization is very difficult to see.
How does GitLab deal with those issues of management? With as many people as it has, how does it really function in terms of making sure that those connections, but also that managers have the training that they need, or the clarity, or how does that work? What was part of their playbook that was so effective that you found? And then translatable for other people who weren't fully remote?
I will say, first of all, GitLab is not a perfect organization, and so they haven't solved everything about management.
Right.
There are still things to be solved, but I think one of the things they really nailed early on was this idea of being a manager of one, self-management, which is something I think is going to become more and more popular, this sort of decentralization of management, understanding how to manage your own work. And then instead of someone managing your work, there's somebody who is directing your output or directing your outcomes, right? So if your manager is telling you, you need to hit this target, you figure out how to do it, that works much better in a distributed environment than your manager saying, I need to watch you do this and teach you how to do it from my own experience. So understanding how to empower people to self-manage their work and doing that through very strong documentation, boring things like SOPs, playbooks, things that people need so that they can follow a set of steps to get to an outcome until they learn how to do the process. All those things are really boring. But
I think it's really the clarity of work and work design, which GitLab had to do in order to to function and that clarity, you no longer need as many managers when you actually have understanding about what you're doing. I mean, that's what managers are there for, basically, if there isn't clarity. Because holacracy is something that I've studied, and you basically don't have any managers because everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So that's very interesting for me towards the end of 2022. And when people are going back to the office, using hybrid models and sort of all over the place, really. Coming from a sort of remote first experience through your entire career, how did you see that evolution happening? Because at the same time, there were a lot of people who were having epiphanies about, I can live differently. You'd already made that choice so long ago, but they were making that choice or having that revelation for the first time. What was that like coming from your perspective?
It was sort of affirming, to be honest. Seeing people experience the flexibility of being able to work from any location and seeing them be able to build their lives with a flexible schedule or with a comfortable environment and still be highly productive and maybe even be more productive. Of course, that's super affirming because it's something I had always believed about myself. And I had seen it in so many other places, but culture had always told me that wasn't the right way to do things. I also was very passionate about the future of the global workforce.
Okay.
And so for me, this also was another proof point that we can have a highly distributed global workforce. It is possible to do that, to see so many different people around the world being able to accomplish this and to work together across cultural borders and boundaries and time zones and everything else. It was very affirming that there was definitely something here. It, for me, confirmed that this is what the future of work looks like.
You then went to Upwork, another really important element of the future of work. And I know you were sort of working on the internal experiences there. Part of the future of work for me is so much about the blended workforce and having a workforce which is employees and non-employees, freelancers, fractional consultants and contractors, as well as, we now drones and robots and agentic AI. Your feelings about how work worked with regard to location and also the different elements of the blended workforce, did that shift for you as you started to work at Upwork?
So I actually went to Upwork for largely this reason. While I was at GitLab, I had started my master's program in industrial organizational psychology, and I was learning a lot about how different organizations worked. And I was seeking an applied learning experience.
Okay.
So, this was where, like I said, GitLab had been grown in a lab to be perfect conditions, and I was seeking a different sort of organization. I had encountered, different types of worker engagements and relationships at Toptal, and I believed there was a lot of potential there. And Upwork was this, again, just this perfect sort of environment where, again, the CEO, Hayden Brown, was really bought in on remote work, really believed that this was the future, but they had the challenge of transitioning from being an office-based organization to being a remote-first organization. And as you mentioned, they were incorporating people from the talent network into the organization, which is a core principle and practice that Upwork involves in all of its strategy. And so I wanted to explore all of those factors and see how that worked. So to go to your question about what I learned some really interesting things about engagement.
Okay.
I think if I could sort of drill collaboration down to its basic elements, it's really, again, just information transfer. Collaboration is really just about trading work back and forth and doing it in a very effective way. But engagement is people's relationship to the organization. It's their relationship to the people that they work with. It's their feeling of affinity toward the organization. And that's where we really have differences between people who are maybe located in the same country where the executives are located and who work full time, as do the executives, and who go on in-person retreats and might see management there,
Right.
versus people who are working maybe part-time and might have other clients and maybe live in another part of the world where they're working sort of off hours, but this is a good pay source for them. You can already see the sort of implications for engagement with the company there, right? And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's no reason why we all have to have a highly engaged, emotional connection with our workplace. That's one of the sort of fallacies that I think we've come to believe in the past several years, is that we need to feel emotionally engaged with our work. I would beg to differ. I would say that we need to be effective at our work. We need to have a source of motivation. We need to have proof that our work is doing something that we believe in.
Right.
We do need to have some sort of a mission that we're contributing to, but we don't need to necessarily be deeply emotionally engaged. And that's one thing that I learned from working with people who were more, I'm not going to say contingent workforce, because people had been working with Upwork for a very long time.
Sure.
And so this is a long-standing relationship. And it was also one of many factors in their life, and maybe not the main one. So for me, that was an eye-opening.
It has been interesting over the last 10 years to see how much more, how many more companies are using the extended talent pool, as it's often called. Obviously, there are these differences in people's relationships with a company, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are less engaged, but they may be less emotionally engaged. How do you see, from a employee experience or a worker experience point of view, to bring people together on a project, or to help people be more effective working together, doing that collaboration, having those effective interactions and communication when they're coming from very different perspectives?
Yeah, that's the challenge. One of the biggest eye-openings that I have had is that when people are working on a project that is only a part of maybe what they do in their day, they can still be very effective without necessarily being part of a community. And so I'll give you an example. I worked pretty closely on some HRIS problems with a developer who was located in India. Wonderful person. And we worked back and forth, solving some really thorny technical questions for a long time, trying to implement a new performance management program. And it was difficult to do, but we got it done in the end. And I never truly felt that I got to know this person. Even though we worked together constantly all the time, we were always in each other's message boxes, solving problems together, really attacking the problem, being very effective in our work, really proud of our outcomes. And yet we didn't really connect as people. And I hadn't experienced that before. That was something that I was accustomed to, always building an emotional connection, some
that's
sort of like
interesting.
a relationship.
What are the key things that you think need to happen next, and how can they best be sort of energized into happening?
The foundation for the future of work is here. Everything we need for the future of work is here. And now we really just need to bring some of the organizations along. And this is the challenge that I've been trying to tackle, is how do we actually accomplish that? And so I think one thing that we need, and we need pretty urgently, is a variety of different models that we can use. I think our operational models that we've built for remote work are generally fairly geared toward all remote organizations, maybe more startup-y. We really haven't nailed a distributed model for a larger scaling or even an enterprise level organization. I think that once organizations get above 5,000-10,000 people, there aren't great answers for how to do that in a distributed way. So I'd like to see just a more variety of models, right? I think there are a couple of models, but I think we need to have more examples of how things can actually work. The flat structure, very asynchronous, very decentralized organization, I think we've nailed that model. But we need something that is going to work for a more traditional corporation. I believe some of the larger organizations that have returned to office will be rolling back something to a more distributed level sometime in the future. And they will probably do that with some sort of a strategy and a plan and an operational playbook. I'm very excited to see what's going to come out of the next 5 years as we see those organizations mature into distributed work.
Each company is finding out what works for them or their division or their company. I see that as being what makes it so complicated, because each company has to work it out. And they haven't had the people in the organization, they haven't had the focus on work that you have had, that the role that you've had is so necessary at any organization to say, well, how are we going to set this up? Because it's about location, but it's about clarity, and it's about management, it's about hierarchy, and all of those things. What were some of the things that really jumped out at you from the theoretical academic study to then when it was, okay, this is what it's really like when we're actually living it on a daily basis?
First I want to respond to something that you said earlier, because when we're talking about models, I think it's so much more than how many days people spend in office, but many companies have sort of stopped at we need to spend X percent of time connecting and the rest of time we just work remotely. And I think a lot of people came out of the pandemic really because they had a couple of years of remote work experience during the pandemic, believing that they knew how to work effectively remotely.
Perfect. What are a couple of those things that people aren't digging into or recognizing that they need to do to be effective, and that isn't being addressed, I think is a critical thing?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things is, and it again, this is something that's not sexy, but having standard operating procedures and behavioral standards is clearly documented and consistently applied throughout the organization is crucial in remote work. It is absolutely a deal breaker if you don't have people understanding how they are supposed to work, where do they put their work, how do they document it, how do they collaborate, how do they manage their time, how do they run a meeting. All of those things need to be clarified and set out very clearly for everyone in the organization.
Within a company that may be different divisions and departments may be doing that in different ways, because one's, a group of engineers and the other one's marketing.
That was one of the big projects that we worked on at Upwork, was really standardizing a lot of the ways that people worked throughout the organization. I worked with the chiefs of staff in various parts of the organization. We did things like streamlining the tools that people used, implementing templates and expectations. And then I also published and worked with the executives throughout the organization to publish behavioral standards. And so these were things as simple as a expectation for how meetings were to be run, but also, more complicated, like how do we share information? What does it mean to, document something? Where does it go? And then we set up a knowledge hub that was much more functional than what had previously existed, that was accessible to all of the organizations so that people could actually access and understand how work was done, not just in their team, but in other parts of the company as well. The idea is to create this sense of information transfer. And this gets to the second point that I think is crucial for distributed companies, which is internal transparency. This is a sticking point for many people. Internal transparency is a red flag for many leaders. And it's really difficult because it is one of those things where you have to sort of decide, how transparent of an organization do we want to be? If we buy in on transparency, then we can facilitate distributed work. If we don't buy in on transparency, then we're going to have challenges with distributed work. It's really like it's a one-way door decision.
To be able to adapt to where we're going, where every company is going in terms of being technology driven and AI superpowered, there has to be this transparency because we're moving too fast. Do you see it differently from that?
I don't think that all companies will end up being transparent. But I do think that if companies want to really go for distributed work, then they will have to adopt internal transparency. I think that's the flag, right? That's the line that you have to cross it or not cross it. And I think that may be a lot of what is holding people back and holding organizations back.
I love the fact that you've described so much of effectively the design of work, identifying and documenting and then adjusting and tweaking how people are working and to be effective and having that standardized, which is fascinating. Then going back to the academic study of industrial organizational psychology, and then how that differed, or what more that you learned as you put that into practice and lived it at Upwork, which was, adapting to remote first.
Two big takeaways. The reason I'm looking around is there's a book, and I don't see it. I usually keep a book on my desk that's called The Forest Ranger. Ooh. It was written in the 1960s, and I studied this in one of my classes at Harvard. And it is the manual, or rather, it's an exploration of how forest rangers in the United States were trained. It was literally written in the 1960s, and so. Okay. For me, this is the most insightful book into distributed operations that I've ever read, and here's why. Okay. Forest rangers were expected to go out into the field and run entire large tracts of land with people reporting to them, with interactions with the community, with decisions they had to make about land use rights and local governments. And they had to do all of this before there were strong communication networks. They were not able to phone back to the home office and ask a question. They were often in very rural areas. They might only be able to send a telegram every couple of weeks. They didn't have communication directly with any source of authority. And so they had to operate completely independently. So if you think about the manager of one, this is the most stellar example. Right. So how is this done? How did they accomplish this? They sent, and in those days they were all men, so they sent these men out on these extended apprenticeships, and they gave them this very, very clear manual, going back to transparency and documentation. They had everything documented, and inside of the manual was couched a philosophy. There was a philosophy of decision-making that was present there. And they would go through the apprenticeship and they would learn everything in the manual. And a lot of people would opt out because they didn't agree with the philosophy. But those that kept with the program and opted in were the ones who felt that the philosophy of the Forest Service and the practices of the Forest Service were aligned with their personal morals and their personal beliefs. And then they could go out into the field and they could make decisions that felt right to them and that aligned with their training. And the Forest Service could completely trust them because it knew that they had gone through this program. So for me, that holds so many secrets about distributed work.
For sure.
How do we train people to be able to operate independently? What does it mean to identify with a philosophy and identify with behavioral standards and be able to really integrate those into yourself, or that those integrate naturally with who you are as a person and how you want to work? How do we implement that in organizations? And I think that there it opens the door for organizations to have a different set of philosophies, different operating models, different standards, but they have to clarify them. They have to make it very clear to people what they're expected to do. And if people buy in and are completely into it, then they can be trusted to do their work independently. That's a complete mind shift. But it worked for 100 years for the Forest Service. Right.
And what it means then is that you'd maybe hire someone and then but there'd be kind of like an onboarding, let's just try this out, because until somebody really tried to live those values or live that philosophy, you wouldn't really know. Most people will be working in some kind of hybrid model. What advice do you have for them? And let's just assume sort of medium-sized companies. Large companies can have some very specific issues, rather have something which is sort of broader based. You've addressed particular points they might need to be paying attention to, for example, documentation. Are there things that you think they really need to be thinking through strategically or tactically to help make their hybrid models and distributed work more effective?
I've got to say something that has been said before, but I think it bears repeating. I think it's really important to remember that a hybrid organization is a digital-first organization. It is still a distributed organization. Everyone is not there. Some people are there and some people are not there. Every day, every meeting, every call, interaction, some people are not in the room. And truly embracing that and becoming a digital-first organization doesn't block your ability to have a functioning hybrid organization. In fact, it enhances it. It really will make your hybrid organization more powerful.
Right.
It will help people to get the most out of work, whether they're in the office or not, and it will reduce frustration. It will increase collaboration. It will increase affinity. It will all of the things that you need to have a highly functioning team can be empowered by really embracing the digital first mentality. And I know that's been said before, but I will keep saying it until I start to see it happen, because that's also the most challenging, right? Because what that means is that organizations can't retreat and say, well, we have people in the office 3 days a week, so we don't necessarily need to evolve quite as quickly. It's not an emergent issue. We can take our time with this. I don't think that's true. I think that it is an emergent issue and that companies need to be addressing it right away.
Oh, I so agree. It's so urgent. How does digital first manifest itself most importantly, I guess? What are the sort of top 3 things that you think people really have to focus on when they're thinking we need to change to be more to be digital first?
Understanding time is probably the top thing. From a leadership perspective, this means understanding something along the lines of core hours. What does it mean when people have time overlap? How do we set up systems throughout the organization that facilitate both overlap and times of asynchronous communication? For managers, it involves structuring work in a way that can be effective, whether it's done asynchronously or synchronously. And then for individuals, it involves time management practices. This always shows up. The problem signal for all of this not working is meetings. So if you have meeting overload, you have a time problem. But meetings are the signal that they're the flag that something is wrong. They are not the thing to fix. Time management is the thing to fix. So that's number one. Second is communication. So communication needs to be done digitally. It needs to be done in writing. It needs to be done via pretty strict actual formats. You need to have processes for communication. You need to have specific ways that things are done throughout the organization. Some of that needs to be practiced by leadership so that they are modeling it for the rest of the company, but a lot of that hits at the manager level. That's really a manager issue, to take whatever is given and to make sure that your team is implementing it. And for individuals, it's relatively easy if your manager tells you how to do something to do it. So that's really a manager problem. And then last is collaboration. So collaboration needs to be systematized. It needs to happen on as few disparate tools as possible. So the company needs to make a strategic decision. This usually lives with IT and operations that designates exactly where work will be done, on which digital systems will it be done, and then works with maybe procurement and anyone else to just deprecate some of the extra systems, because we often have tool proliferation.
Sure.
Again, that's a flag that collaboration isn't happening well because people are trying to find different ways to do it.
Yeah.
But collaboration really needs to be systematized and brought into as few places as possible. What that does is it opens up a transparent hub for collaboration where people can see what others are working on. They can copy ideas from one another. They can quickly drop in and share ideas or contribute to each other's projects. So all of that needs to happen in a single place where people can see where work is happening. Basically, that replaces the office in this very sort of symbolic, but also a little bit literal way. So those are the 3 things.
Overall, of course, that systems thinking. I had this huge aha about, 8 years ago, and I was like, the future of work is a systems problem. And you really summed that up so well in terms of the different elements which really thread throughout every organization, the system of every organization, and of course their business ecosystem as well. JJ, thank you so much for such an extraordinary experience and an incredibly rich and deep and meaningful wrap-up that everybody can try and break down into the different pieces, because there's a lot that you've just said that people need to be thinking about to try and get digital first, and then think about how to be distributed in a really effective way. So thank you so much for everything that you shared.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. And thanks for all of the conversations that you have. As you know, I'm a fan. So I'm pleased to be here talking with you today. And I thank you for the conversation.
I'm always learning, and I've learned so much today, as I always do. So I really appreciate it. Thanks so much again to JJ Reader, workplace innovator and culture transformation leader. You can find out more about JJ on LinkedIn, as well as go to her website, jjreeder.com, jjreeder.com. You can also find a link to the Forest Ranger book she mentioned in the show notes. Immediate action tip. To become digital first: 1, understand time, such as core hours. 2, communicate digitally, documenting processes. And 3, systematize collaboration, designating how and when work happens. If you're interested in more insights about how work dynamics are affecting your team or company, sign up for one of my new executive coaching sessions. We can discuss top priorities and your most pressing questions, whether that's about managing distributed workers, leading multi-generational teams, or how to scale rapidly in the modern work environment. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it with a friend. You can also write a quick review wherever you watch or listen. For more curated, useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter on flexos.work. Thanks for watching. See you next time.